Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alaoui, leadership consultant and author of Unfolding Peace 9 Leadership Principles to Create Cultures of Well-Being, Belonging, and Peace. I'm a member of the Global Compassion Coalition, and on behalf of the GCC, I am pleased to welcome you to this event, exploring the history, present day manifestations, and possible future of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Together, we will seek to understand the driving forces behind this ongoing tragedy, as well as the lessons we can all learn about how to not only prevent conflict, but to promote and embed peace. On this journey today, I am joined by the wonderful Sandy Tolan. Sandy is professor of journalism at the University of Southern California and author of two books, Children of the Stone and The Lemon Tree, on the tragedy of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Welcome, Sandy.
Nice to be with you, Kawtar.
Thank you. So throughout our conversation today, I want to invite those watching to post questions and comments in the chat. I do know that you will do this anyway, but I do want to just ask us to be mindful and respectful of the fact that this is a very sensitive topic. And so I want to request of the audience to please just keep the comments kind and respectful. Now, Sandy, we want to explore a big and broad question today. Is justice and equality possible in Israel and Palestine? And to start us off, I want to invite you to share with us some of the historical context of this war. I know that you've covered it for more than 30 years, I believe. And so if you could please start us off with sharing some of what you've observed and some of what you know about the context.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's great to be with you, Kawtar, and I'm really happy to know about the Global Compassion Coalition, which I didn't know before, and very happy to be part of this conversation. And of course, you asked a very easy question to begin with: is justice and equality possible for Israelis and Palestinians? It's a very complicated answer. I believe, the short answer is yes, but the longer answer would take a lot more than the hour we have. But let me do as you invite, try to set some historical context here. I think one of the reasons I wrote my book, The Lemon Tree, which is a story of two families, one Israeli and one Palestinian, whose common history is the same house in what is now in Israel in the town of Ramleh, is I know that many people grew up in the United States anyway with what I call the Leon Uris history, the history told in the book Exodus by Leon Uris, of the heroic birth of Israel out of the Holocaust. And there's a lot of powerful truth in that book, but there is so much missing. And what is most profoundly missing is the story of the Palestinians. And one of the things I wanted to do in that book was show how, although it's not possible to equate historical tragedies, what I did want to set out is to show that the Palestinian Nakba, or the catastrophe in which 750,000 Palestinians were either driven out or fled in terror in the years of 1948 and 49, is as foundational to Palestinian identity as the Holocaust is to Israeli identity. Again, not to compare the two events, but just to measure their impact on identity and longing and sometimes rage and all these different emotions. So what I wanted to do, in terms of the current tragedy and the really annihilation of Gaza in so many ways, I think it would be helpful to set a little bit of a context for Gaza as well. So what happened in 1948 is 750,000 people basically went into exile. They went into refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, the West Bank, and in Gaza, which was overrun almost overnight or over a period of a few weeks or months in 1948 and 49. And it turned this very sleepy strip of land full of orange groves and what one Palestinian writer called the land of sad oranges, was now turned into this teeming series of refugee camps in a very, very small strip of land. You're talking only about 40 kilometers by maybe 20 kilometers. I don't know exactly, but somewhere in there. So you had all these people, and as was the case with Palestinians all over the globe, and all the refugee camps and those who went into the diaspora in London or Chicago or San Francisco, they wanted the right to go home. The UN decided it had the right, they had the right of return, but there was never any enforcement power behind that. And meanwhile, Israel destroyed the villages, the more than 418 villages that Palestinians had lived in prior to 1948 were destroyed specifically so that Palestinians could not exercise their right of return. And so this is a huge context for understanding the events that led up to 1940 to October 7th, 2023. Again, not to justify the horrific measures, the horrific attacks that Hamas made on October 7th, but to understand some of that context, I think, is essential. And then, of course, what we've seen since then is really the utter destruction of Palestinian society and more than 35,000 lives in Gaza. We'll talk about that as well. And happy to give additional context. We could be sitting here for hours with this sort of context, but happy to start out with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandy. Absolutely. I mean, for me, what I appreciate is that willingness to look at both sides of the story, because any story told only from one lens is never comprehensive, and we can never find the answers on one side. And so just for me as a child growing up watching images of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict on television, I do remember seeing children throwing rocks, for example, Palestinian children throwing rocks, and just thinking as a child in my own self, like, what would drive me to do that? What kind of desperation would I need to be in to think that just with a small rock, I could actually have an impact? And I did, of course, grow up hearing more of the Palestinian lens to the conflict and the Arab and Muslim lens. But I think there's a lot of trauma that's happened on both sides that really cannot justify, but explains a lot of what we're seeing. And the reason we're here is really to try to give a little bit of context, a little bit of more broader understanding to what is truly happening. And for me, I think those answers lie also in the psychology of the conflict, which is not something that we're really looking at very much. And so, Sandy, I know that when we spoke last week very briefly, you mentioned that you've noticed observable differences on the ground in the 30 years that you've been covering this conflict, and that you've been going there and see population on both sides. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've observed as differences?
Yeah, I can. And I do want to go back to those images, to start with those images of children, including who were known as the Children of the Stone, including one young man who's now a fine musician, Ramzi Abu Redwan, whose story I told in my book, Children of the Stone. He was one of those kids at age 8 years old in the 1980s, throwing stones at Israeli soldiers who were occupying Palestinian land. After 1967, Israel captured many of the surrounding lands, including the West Bank and Gaza, Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights. And Ramzi was part of this army of children throwing stones to try to bring the attention of the world to the occupation. So what happened with that particular intifada, which is known, is, I think, literally in Arabic, it means the shaking off. It's also can be translated as uprising. That first intifada was an attempt to expel the Israelis from Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza. And it actually led to the so-called Oslo peace process. Now, that process in 1993 was, for many people, they thought this is finally going to be, two states living side by side in peace, if not perfectly equal economically, et cetera. It was going to be two sovereign states. That was the dream. although interestingly and really importantly, it was never spelled out in the agreement. But many Palestinians, including Yasser Arafat, the late leader of the Palestinians of the PLO,
Mhm.
took it to mean like we will work out the details on the ground and we're going to have a state. Well, the state was never created for many complicated reasons,
Mhm.
including the fact that many Israeli leaders that followed, including Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu, didn't ever want there to be a Palestinian state, no matter what fig leaf they presented. So
Mhm.
this gets to your question. The first time I went to Palestine, Israel, was in 1994, and it was a year after the Oslo deal was signed. And I was so curious because I was driving around the West Bank, and I was driving on this very smooth road, like it had just been built, like smooth as glass, and it was on the West Bank. And I thought, but it was for VIPs and settlers only. And I thought, why did they just build a road if they're planning, if this is part of a Palestinian state? And why does Israel continue to build settlements? At the time, there were about 110,000 settlers, Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Now there's more than 500,000. At the time, there were a few settlements ringing parts of what was then called Arab East Jerusalem, where Palestinians wanted their capital to be. Now
Yeah.
it's completely surrounded so that you can't really get there unless by special permit. And people used to come when I first came there. People went back and forth between the West Bank and Jerusalem to pray, to shop, to visit family, quite frequently, and it wasn't so complicated. Now it is so difficult for a Palestinian who wants to pray, who wants to come and just be part of the historic dreamed for capital of Jerusalem, of Al-Quds in Arabic.
Mhm.
They can't make it. In fact, I was telling the story about Ramzi. He grew up and founded a music school, which was his dream to do. And 10 years later, after I did a piece for National Public Radio about him, he actually had come back and built this music school. So I documented that in my book. And what happened was he started putting together these series of Beethoven symphonies from the first all the way through the ninth. And I went to do a piece about when he did the Ninth Symphony, and they had to sneak over uh, the wall. Some people were in trunks. Some people were, the fact that they had to do this shows that the restrictions and the tightening of the dreams and the challenge to the existence of the continuing existence of a free and sovereign Palestine, it gets more and more difficult really by the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, a couple of things stand out in what you said, Sandy. Um, and the first one is really that unequal power dynamic that we witness. For me, again, growing up, I've heard these stories, and what I learned much later is that when there's an unequal power dynamic, it's almost impossible to reach agreements. The other thing is when we're not even clear about what do we mean by peace, right? As you highlighted in the Oslo Accords, one thing I'm finding right now is that a lot of leaders don't necessarily seem to know what peace is, or talk about peace as if it's the day after the armed conflict ends. But that's a really misidentification of what peace is and how we can build peace.
Yes, and this is such an important question and such an important word in the context of the tragedy of Israel and Palestine, and the dreams that Palestinians had have been for a state of their own. Some people wanted two states. Some people want one state with all the people between the river and the sea with equality and justice, Israelis and Palestinians. Some people think there should be a confederation where there's
Mhm.
separate entities. But whatever it is, what happened in 1993 when the Oslo Peace Accord was signed, people saw their own freedom increasingly restricted. So the
Mhm.
word peace, at first I was a little confused. Why would peace be a dirty word for so many Palestinians. Well, it's not that the absence of conflict is a problem, but it's like when there's peace for one side, when it's calm and tranquil among Israelis, that doesn't mean that it's the same for Palestinians. When you have literally hundreds of checkpoints, children traveling,
Mm-hmm.
when I wrote my music book, or Children of the Stone, little girls would be stopped in a van coming back from a concert. And I remember one little 10-year-old girl, Ala, who was forced to open her violin case and show the violin to soldiers at a checkpoint. And then he forced her to play a song. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's this sense of humiliation, and
Absolutely.
there's this sense of restriction,
Yeah.
which is why for so many Palestinians, when people talk about the peace process, it didn't bring them the freedom that they've longed for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just hearing that and hearing that the checkpoints I know are a major factor that increases in some way that sense of humiliation, the sense of oppression. And
Yeah.
so we have this dynamic where we're dealing with two peoples who are deeply traumatized already. And on top of that, we layer on it this unequal power dynamic and this deep sense of humiliation. um, and in the experiment that I led with David Sauvage about radical empathy between a Muslim and a Jew, we've
Hmm.
really surfaced a lot of these psychological drivers to the war, and specifically related to the Muslim and Jewish identity. And this is a part of that, is that sense of not only are we having to live in a daily reality that strips us of our bare dignity at times, but then we add to that the fear that we're all feeling, and we add to that the sense of um, not even knowing whether there's hope at the end. And I think that's what I'm hearing you speak to. The word that started with so much promise for the Oslo Accord ended up, at least for one side, becoming a lot more oppressive.
That's right, and that's one of the reasons that people feel like, don't give me a peace process if it doesn't involve our freedom, which is a reasonable thing to say, right? But I think you're right that, I mean, both Israelis and Palestinians are, two of the most traumatized populations in the world. The Holocaust has made a horrible, it's a horrible memory. It's a powerful driver. It brought
Mhm,
the phrase "never again." But I think people are beginning to see that terrible moment in history is not justification, or should
mhm,
not be justification for some of the things that are going on. For example, in Gaza today, where you have 35,000, nearly 35,000 people dead, um, I think at least 14,000 of them children. Nearly every university, there's a phrase that I'd never heard before called scholasticide. Nearly every university, everyone has been damaged or destroyed. Um, and of course, you have now famine breaking out. So, like,
mhm,
that can't be used as, and most people I know, Jew or Gentile, are not using that as a justification, but it should not be. And I think the whole question of conversation and dialogue we're doing right now. I mean, I think I will talk to almost anyone, and I think the idea of a Muslim and a Jew, a Palestinian and Israeli sitting down, in and of itself can be a beautiful thing on an individual basis. Then
mhm,
there's a power dynamic that neither has a possibility of changing. It's then becomes just more of a personal, in my opinion.
mhm,
My opinion is changing a little bit. In my opinion, it can be very limiting. It can be personally gratifying for each person. And
mhm,
when you see two individuals reconciling in a certain way, it's very powerful, right? And there are
mhm,
examples. And so I think that there's a limitation when you're looking at a United States that is literally sending tens of billions of dollars in arms and scolding Benjamin Netanyahu while supplying him the weapons that have been killing Palestinians. Now they're pausing one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, and
mhm,
as many others have already said, I would say, good, but too little and way too late. Um,
Mhm.
but I think there is something else happening, which is why I said I think I'm maybe changing my mind here in a sense, because even though the student movements in the United States, which I'm more familiar with than in Europe and elsewhere, to call attention to the slaughter in Gaza, I think generally speaking, and almost without exception, have been peaceful,
Mhm.
and they have brought attention to an issue that some people aren't comfortable uh, having having this pointed out. But what's really interesting to me is how many young American Jews are taking part in these, and there are
Mhm.
so many in the encampments and elsewhere that are saying to Israel and to the United States, for that matter, not in my name. And
Mhm.
a beautiful piece in The Nation I just sent you this morning, actually. Uh,
Mhm.
and one of the people who's been participating in different of these encampments said, he believes he's a Jew and he believes that there's a new kind of Jewishness being born inside these encampments, and if anybody wants to look it up, you can just look it up in The Nation magazine. And I thought that was really compelling because I think, and in my faculty, some 60. Last time I counted, there was some 60 Jewish faculty members of the University of Southern California, where I teach, who were objecting to the way that these young people were treated when police came in and basically broke up the camp. And some of them have been arrested, others are facing academic sanctions. I've been part of a group of faculty trying to push back on that and make our leaders at the university more accountable.
Mhm.
A lot of us believe that the reason they're being punished is the kind of speech they're exercising. I know, when President Biden said, order must prevail when he was
Mhm.
on the air a week or two ago, I don't think, and then he started smearing these protests as hateful,
Mhm.
anti-Semitic, violent, and that has not been my experience in the many hours that I've spent there. And we could sort of break that down a little bit later if you want.
Absolutely.
I think that there is something happening now, and you've seen even since the last most horrific war on Gaza that Israel waged in 2014, you started to see young Americans and young Jewish Americans um, expressing a different point of view than their elders.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
and that's happening, I think, more than ever now, and that might change things.
Absolutely. And I want to speak to that a little more because I really understand when I hear you say that, the kind of experiment about radical empathy can work at the personal and interpersonal level. I've been studying this work about how do we create peace and how do we create conflict very in depth for about 15 years,
Mhm.
including with a trauma informed lens, then a lens of, diversity and inclusion. Um, and what I've found is that there is something that's very simple and yet very highly misunderstood about how we create violence versus how we create peace. And compassion or empathy are at the very core of that. And so, and then there's the fact that we're all interconnected. It is now scientifically proven that we are interconnected. And so I think when groups who are supposed to be made enemies come together across the divides and find within themselves the courage and the true humanity to say, we stand with each other. We see each other suffering, and we will not recreate the narrative of conflict that we inherited. I think there's something that really powerful that moves through the psyche and gives permission and courage to others to say, I can stand for a more balanced narrative. And that's very much something that David and I have both seen and witnessed as well in our journey.
Mhm.
And so to me, I see it as they feed off of each other. Where I think there's something that we need to do really differently is like you mentioned about the leadership. Our leaders don't have the empathy and the compassion or the skills to even understand the impact of trauma, to recognize where they might be having or recreating trauma, and much less the power dynamics, which need both understanding but also compassion. And so I think some of the questions that I see a lot of people grappling with is how do we make sure that there's more compassion in this conversation? How do we bring people together across more divides? And so I'd love to hear, Sandy, from your experience, having been on the ground, having worked with people here in the West, what have you seen that works?
Well, these are very hard and very good questions. You're not letting me off the hook here at all, are you? Um,
Well, I mean, we
no,
just want to look at it
I'm
from
joking. I mean,
diversity.
well, I think I have sort of multiple answers and multiple feelings. I think again, like the individual power of witness up to the experience of the other, whoever that other is, if it's an Israeli or a Palestinian or anyone else for that matter, is extremely powerful, again, on a personal basis. And that's a lot of what the lemon tree was actually all about. Um, but, and so at the same time, for so many Palestinians, most who I know, the
Mhm,
this whole dialogue, this whole idea of mutual witness and empathy was what the Oslo period was all about. And when it
mhm,
was at its most hopeful, I mean, I know quite a few people who think it was written in, it was deliberately not written in the word Palestine, occupation, freedom. These words were not in the Oslo documents. And so some people say it was never going to be a happy two-state solution. But many people did have hope, Palestinians and Israelis, and many other people too. And but what was happening at that point is, groups of Palestinians were going to the concentration camps in Europe to witness what Jews went through in the Holocaust. You had you had Israelis and American Jews starting to understand what the Nakba meant and
mhm,
why so many Palestinians wanted to just go home. They had been expelled and then their villages were destroyed. So there was like this beginning to be this mutual understanding on a
mhm,
citizen to citizen level and these NGOs and smaller groups. And it was, you could see it. It was beautiful in many ways. But meantime, the powers that be were continued to build up the West Bank, and rings, and the U.S., although it was sort of slapping the hands of various Israeli prime ministers, didn't ever, during the entire Oslo period, not once did a U.S. leader say, you better stop building those settlements or we're going to cut off loan guarantees. We're going to cut off weapons shipments. We're going to cut off the billions of dollars in aid. That would, to me and to many other people, be a logical step because it
mhm,
had worked before. It worked under President Reagan. It worked under the first President Bush when James Baker, the Secretary of State, threatened Yitzhak Shamir with the suspension of loan guarantees if he didn't stop building settlements, and they stopped. So the witness is so powerful. I agree, and I can only imagine how you felt that and how that experience had been so transformative for so many people. But at the same time, like that, so Palestinians that I know would be skeptical about re-entering something like this if the structure wasn't changed. And I think, but at the same time, going back to feeling hopeful, I think that these young people are creating another model. One of the things that I found so amazing, in the USC encampment that was taken down twice by police and including about a week ago, is that they basically created their own societies in these places. There were the very clear rules of conduct. There
mhm,
are medic tents. There are food tents. There are libraries. There's an entire. They were doing teach-ins. I mean, they
mhm,
were having kite making. They were having yoga. They were having during Passover. They were having seders and
mhm,
cottage meetings. And so again, the idea that these are anti-Semitic, I mean, when so many Jewish students themselves are participating, and when so many Jewish faculty, for example, at USC, are objecting to the way the students, whoever they are, whatever religion they are, were being treated, it shows there's a whole lot more. So I think if this is an example that can begin enlightening more people in and around the camps that come, these encampments, or whatever that is going to grow out of them, can come with curiosity and openness and lay down their fears, then I think that there is more possibility there. But I think it's more of a generational question and not something that can directly affect the powers, because I mean, Biden's very entrenched in his belief, and even though he's made some shifts, I think they're fairly minor, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, as I hear you speak, I'm taking this in and I'm sort of looking at below the surface because my work is always at the level of the human. And
Mhm.
I think our leaders are human. The question is, how do we continuously end up with leaders um, whose priorities are not necessarily aligned to serving humans? And who at the end of the day end up dehumanizing us once again and recreating this cycle of violence that we find ourselves in time and again. And yet our leaders don't stop long enough to say, how are we here? What did we do wrong? Because clearly there's something that we've been doing that's not working. And so, what I'm hearing you say as far as the encampments is, I'm hearing you talk about a new model that has rules of conduct, that brings in integrity. There's a follow up around the conversation, there's safety, there's trust that gets built. Um, and again, people who are standing up and saying there's a different way and we're going to stand for that together, right? I know the words both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Well, the phenomenon themselves are so deeply tied that when one increases, the other one increases. And
Mhm.
there's lots of research that shows that. And yet
Mhm.
the words are used in very, very triggering ways at times. They're used almost as a cover to not go into the real conversations.
Yes, and I think honestly, I think as a political strategy by supporters of Israel, including President Biden, including many so-called Christian Zionists, um, charges of anti-Semitism. I mean, first of all, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic acts are despicable and should be denounced flat out. End of story. But what's happened a lot in recent months and actually over years, in my opinion, is that charges of anti-Semitism that are about events or slogans that, in my opinion, are not anti-Semitic, are then weaponized to silence people. I think that's been at the heart of the university's harsh crackdown and inviting riot police in to shut these camps down, in some
Mhm.
cases violently, even though by nearly every account, the encampments have been peaceful. But so I think part of it, and then part of it is fear. There's a I've talked to some of the senior administrators at USC in recent days, and I've heard them talk about how some students are fearful or feel uncomfortable. So that's important, and no one should be in fear of wearing a Star of David, for example, on around your neck, um,
Mhm.
or a keffiyeh or a hijab, for that matter. And as you say, those denouncements and those incidents are often rise together. Um, so there's been a lot of that. A lot of Muslim students at USC have told me they feel very uncomfortable. So it does work both ways. But if there's a way to bring the temperature down a little bit, like let's take, for example, the phrase "from the river to the sea." Some people think that slogan calls for the extermination of Israel. I don't believe that that's true. I believe what it is an aspiration for equality and justice between Palestinians and Israelis. It's not the old trope of push the Jews into the sea, push Israelis into the sea. at all, in my opinion. And I've never talked to anyone who espouses that wish with that phrase. So, um, you know, I think if I mean, and also that phrase originated, to my understanding, as a Zionist phrase in the 1930s. So I think if there's a way to get people together to like kind of bring down the level of fear and mutual denigration. Um, People that, there are stories of people wandering in, whether it's a Jewish faculty or student, coming into the tent or into the encampment and actually engaging in conversation and having their mind changed about the nature of the encampment. USC did not do that. The president didn't ever set foot in that encampment, to my knowledge. USC has very close ties to the Los Angeles Police Department, and the LAPD does training in Israel. So I think, there was a conflict of interest at work there. But I think that, even though these encampments may not stay indefinitely, I think they've started something that could be expanded into discussions where people are feeling safer on all sides, and maybe that becomes a power in itself.
Absolutely. Safety is absolutely integral, I think, to this conversation. And without safety, what happens is we go into the stress response, and we can only react from a stress response. A response is not available at that time. And so that's exactly how we recreate violence and the cycle of violence. And there's a lot of conversation that feeds the fear. There's a lot of conversation that drives to the fear. And these are sort of the pressure points that continue to drive up the conflict, right? These things that we've talked about, the dehumanization, the language sometimes that's triggering, the intent of the way that we're using that language, not asking ourselves, what is it that really this person means when they're saying this phrase or the other phrase. The other thing I wanted to ask you about with regards to this is the role of the media, specifically when it comes to the power of the media to humanize the conversation. I'm curious about your thoughts on that, Sandy.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I've been a journalist for all of my professional life, which is now over 40 years. I've been a journalist. I've thought a lot about this, and I do believe that one of the most powerful things a journalist can do is to humanize. I don't really like the phrase "the other," but humanize people who we may not be familiar with their life ways, their backgrounds, where they live, why they live the way they do. And, conversely, the most destructive thing I think journalists can do is contribute to dehumanizing. When we saw the defense minister of Israel call Palestinians human animals the day after October 7th, for many people, this contributed to a psychological justification that these are not actually real people. So actually annihilating people by the thousands, I'm less uncomfortable. People would say, I'm less uncomfortable with that. I think because things have gotten to the point that they have, that attitude is shifting. But I do think that the most basic thing, a humanizing thing that a journalist could do is talk to people on different sides, right? And get honest opinions, not just political spin. One of the studies, there's a guy, I think it's George Mason University, did a study of the first, I think it was 51 hours of talk shows in the first few months of the cable shows, the Sunday shows, about the what I do not call it the Israel-Hamas war. I would prefer the Israel-Gaza war, or even the Israel-Palestine war, because there's a lot going on in the West Bank too. But in any case, this particular study revealed that out of 140 guests on these shows in the first few months of the war, 120 were Americans, one was Palestinian. So if you're not talking to Palestinians about a war on Palestinians, what are you doing? And then there's also a lot. There was the story of 40 horrible story of 40 beheaded babies, which has been widely. I mean, make it clear there were horrific atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. I'm not whitewashing that at all, but
Mhm.
when you have stories that get it's like a lie. By the time the truth gets its pants on, the lie is halfway around the world. So it's what happened with that is it accelerated this tolerance for
Mhm.
atrocity of a much greater scale and number. And similarly, this happened with a New York Times story called "Silent Screams of Silence," uh, uh, related to a weaponization of sexual assault, which was later shown to have the reporting itself had many holes in it. But these kinds of
Mhm.
things justified a focus away from what Israel was doing and into another discussion. So I think that is what contributes to
Mhm.
dehumanization. And I think also, even sometimes if you interview people who've been bombed out of a shelter or whatever it is, that's important to do, but also just always portraying people as victims is not showing them in their, this is a grandfather, this is somebody's uncle. That's what I've tried to do in my two books about Palestine and Israel, is to show
Mhm.
people as fully human. And then if you can show them as fully human, you can really um, open up people's hearts. And I think we need so much more of that. And many of us, even those of us safe from the bombs in the West, have been so demoralized. Uh,
Mhm.
but I'm starting to feel like it's a huge toll. But there is a sense that the status quo cannot stand.
Yeah.
And I think through humanization, um, and people being willing to get out of their comfort zone. I mean, I hear again from our college administrators at USC. People, some of these students feel uncomfortable. Well, are you feeling uncomfortable because someone is yelling "Free Palestine," or are you actually in physical danger? Like there's a difference. And in the university, um, ideally, you're there to get out of your comfort zone, to learn something other than what you were led to believe and to grow as a person. And so I think it's really important to keep that notion of humanization like really
Mhm.
front and center, and then not just retreat into our fears and anger.
Yeah. I fully agree with you, and I'm taking that in because I'm very, very aware of the impact of the media and how it portrays Muslim identities in general, and particularly Palestinians, obviously, in this conflict. Um, there is this overall tendency of always being portrayed either as a victim or as a persecutor.
Yeah.
But there's very rarely people who are a part of the conversation who can truly speak to it at all levels, at the level of the heart, of the mind, of academia. And I don't quite know why is it that that's so embedded, I would say, in the media culture. But I certainly witness it.
Yeah, I'm sure you've experienced it, firsthand as a Muslim, and I can only imagine the heartache that creates. And I mean, I one of the things that I run a graduate journalism program at USC, and for years running, we've had majority students of color, journalists of color. We've had an incredible group of people who've applied, and some, including people who wear hijab and other Muslims, and people of so many different backgrounds. And I think that's another, in terms of media images, if there are more people. I mean, back when there was the so-called Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and the East Coast and the West Coast as well. One of the reasons that journalists missed that is because the newsrooms were all white. Nobody knew what was going on. So, I mean, as a pragmatic matter, not just a moral and ethical matter, like
Mhm.
getting as many points of view and as many life experiences into your room makes it for a much richer and more humane and more accurate world.
Absolutely. And then in the field of business, I mean, it's also been shown to be lucrative. And I personally always say, if not for the humanity, at the very least, do it because it pays.
Yeah, it's pragmatic as well as the right thing. It's nice when those two things coincide.
Right, exactly. So it just kind of can remove some resistance. I do also want to speak to the safety aspect, Sandy, because I think it is incredibly important, and it's something that, again, David and I touched on really deeply in our conversation. Sandy, my apologies about that. Can you see me and hear me again?
I can. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can, finally.
Excellent. Okay. Well,
Perfect.
I was doing a little ad-libbing, but let's go and continue. Maybe we can go a little bit past our 11:30. I don't know if that's okay.
I'm okay with that if that works for you as well. Yeah, thank you. All right. So, I mean, when I dropped off, I was speaking to the safety piece. I'm just wondering, is it okay to go back there, or is there something that you were saying?
Absolutely. Let's go
Yeah,
back.
perfect. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so just speaking to the safety piece, one thing that did surface in our dialogues, and for me being a trauma survivor, safety is very visceral. It's something that can have a very, very strong hold on myself. And so, what I do know of safety is that there's a very strong distinction between safety itself, like you said, and the perception of safety. And when we're in a trauma response, we can't distinguish the two because it feels so real. And
Mhm.
so I think dealing with two deeply traumatized people, it is more important than ever that we raise the awareness about how trauma works and that we give people the tools and the understanding of how to unblend the reality of safety from the
Mhm.
perception of safety.
Oh, that's such a great point, and it could be applied going forward in what is emerging as a peace movement. With Palestine at the freedom for Palestine at its center. Um,
Mhm.
and if I think one of the things that could be helpful is if people recognize that, as you put, unblending the perception and the reality of safety or unsafety, if you will. Um,
Mhm.
how that's done, you would know so much more than I would. But I think that there's a role for that. But there's also a role, I think, for understanding what what it is that people could agree on that seems reasonable. Like,
Yeah.
for example, is equality and justice between Israelis and Palestinians a reasonable goal? I mean, I think most people would say yes.
Yeah.
Is the reality between Israelis and Palestinians as it is right now equal and just? I think most people would agree that it's not. And
Mhm.
so when people say, from the river to the sea, they're basically talking about equality and justice for all,
Mhm.
my understanding, and in many other people's understanding of that phrase. So, but what happens is that because of the fear, and also because in some cases, I would say cynical weaponization
Mhm.
of charges of anti Semitism, this gets lost. What gets lost now is the reality of what life is like for Palestinians in the
Mhm.
West Bank. I talked about, earlier about driving down that smooth as glass settlers road in 1994, wondering why it was being built, and now the landscape is just crisscrossed with such roads. So many more settlers, like 5 times as many as when I started, over half
Mhm.
a million now, not including East Jerusalem. 17 cities, settlements ringing East Jerusalem, and the reality and is that with all these hundreds of checkpoints and children not being able to move from one place to another, not to say nothing of the horrors in Gaza right now. I think if people realize that is essentially the status quo, although
Mhm.
an extreme version of that in Gaza right now, but Palestinians have been under restriction and under bombs for decades. And so if people say, well, that's not, this status quo can't hold, then
Mhm.
you could, if people would agree on that, then they could sort of start coming to a vision of what could be. And but I think people maybe first have to recognize that what we do have now, it is essentially one state, in my opinion, with Israel basically controlling who has the higher level of rights and who has the lowest level of rights. And there has been an effort to splinter Palestinians from Gaza to the West Bank. There's no corridor that was supposed to be under the peace process. From the West Bank to East Jerusalem, it's almost impossible to travel there now because you can't get permit. From the diaspora into Palestine now, you have to go through Israeli checkpoints, Israeli port of entry. So if people could see that that's not just and that's not equal, or use language of the schoolyard, is just isn't fair.
Yeah.
If we could recognize that, then we can go to another vision.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think it's again just coming back to that humanity, that shared humanity, and thinking if I was having to go through this, how would I feel?
Yeah,
If this was my day to day, how would I feel? And then from there, finding the compassion to start to really, and also look at this with nuances. And so we are essentially at time, or where we would have been at time. I do want to give you sort of the last word to wrap this up. I mean, we've visited some of the human dynamics below this conflict. We've talked about the power dynamics at the leadership levels.
mhm.
What, in your view, Sandy, what can people do? What can everyday citizens do to really support this sense of seeing this more holistically, building more compassion and more inner power, as we said on our call the other day, to be able to face this conflict and create something different with it?
Yeah, yeah. That's these are such good questions, Kawtar. I appreciate them. Um, one of the things I would say is to read widely. If you only read the New York Times and watch CNN, you're going to get a pretty narrow view. I mean, there are many fine exceptions. There are people, uh, at the New York Times who are doing great work, but there's a certain take on it that I think
Mhm.
doesn't really necessarily allow for a full understanding of both the history as well as the current reality. So if you read the international press, you read, the Guardian, you read Al Jazeera, you read the New Arab in London, you read Haaretz in Israel,
Yeah.
Plus 972, which is a progressive Israeli journalist website. There are so many other places where you can get a sense, or people who watch TikTok are getting a much more sometimes horrific dose of what's actually happening on the ground. And
Yeah.
so just sticking to the mainstream outlets, I think gives you, especially in the United States, I think gives you a pretty narrow view. So I would say starting with that, if people feel like they need to know more, and if they already feel like they do understand the dynamics, then going out there and talking to others. There are a lot of these solidarity groups. Some people are more, comfortable than others, but just trying to be part of something that changes the status quo into something more just and humane. There's lots of possibilities.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandy. I see there's another question, and I'm not sure if you'd be okay to take it.
Absolutely, let's take it.
Okay. Yeah. So the question is, what are your thoughts on the role of journalism in contributing to building pathways to peace?
Yeah, and we touched on that before. I was saying that I think journalism can be a very humanizing and a very dehumanizing instrument. And
Hmm.
I think it's done in this country. It's leaned more towards dehumanizing.
Hmm.
Palestinians are portrayed not as fully human, as victims.
Hmm.
And I noticed that when the death toll kept rising of Palestinians killed in Gaza, it got to 15,000, it got to 25,000, and the very day that it reached 25,000, the New York Times ran the following headline: "The Decline of Deaths in Gaza." And so there is a certain disconnection from reality. And if you read that, you're like, oh, the deaths are declining. But they were, I don't know what the article even meant to say, that the rate was smaller than before. But in any case, I think, um, you know, the journalists have an incredible role to play. And what I tell my students in our grad program, and when I teach, my different narrative writing or podcasting classes, get on the ground, see for yourself. Don't listen to what an editor, don't just take as on faith what an editor says. If you're seeing something different yourself, it's your responsibility to tell that story. And the more you can be on the ground, of course, right now in Gaza, over 100 journalists have died, and most of them Palestinian, trying to tell the story of what's happening. So that is just absolutely atrocious, awful. But the more that we can see, either directly or indirectly from eyewitnesses, the better off we are. So, going to the sources that you trust, that are diverse, that help you build a whole kind of more complex understanding, I would say that.
Yeah, thank you. That really speaks to me. I grew up watching a lot of French media, and in French media, there's a lot of constructive dialogue. And you usually have people around the table that have very different opinions. And when my family immigrated to Canada, I kind of found that to be a little bit lost in the conversation. It seems to be oftentimes one-sided, and then you really have to look for the information as the citizen. And
That's
so,
right.
yeah, so I think just having that desire to go look for the conversations and find the people who have these different views. And then we say we can only make peace with our enemies, right? We can't make peace with the people that we agree with. We already have it. And
Mhm.
so making spaces where we can meet those enemies, those perceived enemies publicly, and have the conversations in a way that's very nuanced and balanced, I think can be really helpful. So Sandy, thank you so much for your time. Any last words before we close today on your end?
No, just other than to say thank you to uh, the coalition. I just love the fact that I've found this group of people, and hope to be in touch again. And it's really great to talk to you, and just I think we have to keep searching, and keep involved as in any way we can to try to forge something that's, as I've said, more just and humane.
Absolutely. Well, thank you as well for your time, and thank you for being a part of this great work and of the Global Compassion Coalition. Like you, I very much am grateful for this space, the people that it brings together, and the fact that it puts compassion at the core of our interactions as human beings.
Absolutely, I appreciate that too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy.